What I wanted to talk about, I mentioned the Mississippi case, and one of the tasks that was given to us is to try to convey risk and to recognize that in this case in coastal Mississippi, the maps that conveyed risk, coastal risk, were significantly out of date. There were advisory maps that were created, and this is just one image of them. It shows both the storm surge inundation in blue. That's an elevated roadbed for a rail line. But in a nutshell, what it showed, the maps were significantly out of date, and so it underestimated the flood elevation for the 100-year 1% annual chance event by 8 to 12 feet vertically. And so we were trying to convey this new understanding of risk to coastal communities, and as you can imagine, it was fraught with all kinds of challenges. The good news is that all communities on the coast adopted these higher standards. But one of the issues I think is interesting is, and David Perks, actually, who did this map, is going to be speaking in my speaker series class next week, and is a good friend. This is a map of the Biloxi Peninsula, and it is a map that would never be created by FEMA because FEMA's maps are used for floodplain regulation, if you will, and flood insurance. Whereas what he did is he looked at the elevation of the peninsula, looked at the 100-year return flood period new data, and in essence overlaid it with planimetric data that showed if you're going to rebuild your home in these zones, this is how high it will have to be elevated. So my point is that this really is a confluence of recognizing the limitations of federal policy and using information and data to better convey risk to homeowners, to inform them and give them choices and options to understand, for example, what it will cost to rebuild in compliance with these new maps. And so he also did cost estimations to estimate how much it would cost, for example, in the lower right-hand quadrant to elevate homes 18 feet above grade. And I'll show some examples of that in just a moment. These are some of the images I took after the storm. This is right on Beach Boulevard. And one of the challenges is how do we effectively capture, quote unquote, the opportunity to rebuild in ways that are safer, recognizing that communities are often trying to rebuild as quickly as they can. So this speed versus deliberation, before they were adopting these higher standards, some communities, like the image on the left, they were trying to rebuild structures beforehand. This was a 3-story condominium. It's being resold as zone residential, and they were trying to have it rebuilt before they adopted more stringent codes and standards. So these are some of the challenges that link our understanding of risk and public policy, for example. The image on the right is an image I took a mile inland, so it gives you some indication of the extent of the storm surge damage. And to me, there's really interesting lessons as to thinking through the idea of recovery as opportunity, opportunity for whom? Who can afford to rebuild? Who chooses to rebuild? How is this going to inform adaptation and retreat strategies? Another fundamental challenge, as I see it, is this notion of rebuilding coastal communities following major events and thinking through what are the appropriate design standards, including the appropriate design standards in the era of climate change. The image on the bottom left is a 16-inch thick steel reinforced concrete home that was built by an engineer. It survived. All the other homes in the surrounding area were destroyed. But is that the future of coastal construction? And if so, who can afford to live there? The image in the center bottom is an image of the happy family eating ice cream that obscures a multi-story condominium that was simply washed away, yet builders are coming back in to rebuild as quickly as possible. Again, trying to build before more stringent codes and standards are adopted. On the upper right-hand portion of the slide is all that remains of a bank. It's the bank vault, which again, when I saw that image, I thought, is this the future of coastal construction, in the storm surge area? I don't think so, but nevertheless, it survived. As did the SS Hurricane Camille, as it's been dubbed, that washed ashore in 1969 following Camille. The prow is facing into the water and it survived. It stayed there, it didn't move, whereas 50,000 homes were simply washed away. This is the manifestation of the new codes and standards that are put in place. And one of the sobering realities is to comply with the 100-year flood or the 1% annual chance flood event. That's what coastal construction looks like in Mississippi. And the real sobering reality is, if you think about it, if Katrina strikes again, and the storm surge exceeded the 100-year flood, some of these homes could be damaged or destroyed again. So, the question becomes, who and should we be rebuilding in some of these areas? The image on the right is one of the 50,000 lots. These images were taken 10 years after the storm. I went back at the request of the governor's office for the 10-year anniversary. When I was there were probably about 20 to 25,000 vacant lots that remained 10 years after the storm. So again, big challenges thinking through rebuilding of coastal communities. And in fact, we talked to communities about the idea of creating an 80-mile linear park that would salvage or save all of these beautiful live oaks. They said no. And yet, after 10 years after the storm, there's still 25,000 vacant lots because the cost of reconstruction is so high, many of them can't afford to do it. So these are big issues for us to think about that span not only recognizing the environmental consequences of hazard, but also who can afford to live there, and what policy choices might we adopt to that recognize that. Again, these are just a scattering of images 10 years after the storm. People still, now they're trying to sell their properties, and in many cases, there aren't willing buyers. Another issue to think about relative to climate change adaptation and resettlement is the idea that following major disasters, communities often rely on FEMA to provide temporary housing, like these types of mobile homes and campers, if you will, whether they're sited on an individual's lot while they rebuild, or if they're in these larger group sites. But these units are poorly built. They're not energy efficient. They're meant formaldehyde. And we have people throughout the coast living in these units for years. In fact, following Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina, they lived in there for more than 5 years. We can do better than that. And in fact, in the governor's office, we proposed an alternative strategy, and we were successful in getting a $400 million grant to build improved emergency housing alternatives. I'm not going to talk about them in great depth, but they were on a wheeled undercarriage. They could be used over and over again. They didn't emit formaldehyde. They were internationally residential code compliant. And many of them could actually be set on a permanent foundation as an alternative. That sounds good. We replaced all of the campers that were in place in Mississippi with these better units. The residents really liked them. We thought it was a better policy idea, but in reality, and in fact, we received this money. FEMA was not too pleased that we, in essence, used political influence, if you will, to gain access to this money. FEMA didn't like the idea. And so if you move forward to the Joplin tornado, they went back to using campers and mobile homes after we spent $400 million developing a better alternative. Because they actually are familiar with utilizing campers and mobile homes. We can do better, but the important lesson here is that just because you come up with a better idea, if those administrative organizations responsible for administering some of these programs don't buy into it, it's a lost opportunity. So I wanted to talk a bit about buyouts or the acquisition of hazard-prone housing and shift gears a bit and talk about some of the applied research that I've been involved in for some time. When I was in state government in North Carolina at the state level, led a team and working with local governments that acquired more than 5,000 flood-prone properties throughout eastern North Carolina. And now I'm doing a lot of applied research based on this topical area. The program is quote unquote voluntary in that residents have to agree to participate. Eligibility is determined by risk, and the method by which that's done is benefit cost analysis, which is fraught with all kinds of issues in terms of undervaluing environmental benefits, for example. Homeowners are typically provided the pre-disaster fair market value, which might be good if you're a middle or upper income homeowner, but if you're poor, and you're provided very modest means to take the buyout, the home is acquired and demolished and the land is turned into open space, the option, the choice of taking that option might be problematic. And also some of the issues to recognize is that the land must be maintained as open space in perpetuity. And so sometimes it's used for commemoration. In other cases, like the image on the bottom left, that's Charlotte. That's used for greenway development. But in the case of Kinston on the upper left-hand corner, it can end up serving as an area of dumping ground of abandoned TVs, or the community may not have the resources to actually maintain that property. So these are some of the big challenges associated with buyouts and the wise use of open space. And I should say that we're also involved in a research project in a training program developing an open space management guide for communities across the U.S. Not surprisingly, there's deep place attachment. This is a very, it's a shock to the system for many communities. If in fact officials come in to talk about buying out your home and tearing it down, you can imagine. It can be pretty upsetting. There's uneven levels of participation, which lead to what we call checkerboarding, which is, every third house is bought out and others remain. Those are real challenges. You're buying down the risk, but you're also tearing apart the social fabric of communities. Buyouts can take a long time. In many cases, they can take many, many years, and I'll explain that, and I'll give an example in just a moment. Most of the communities are thinking through buyouts in the throes of a disaster, so they often don't plan for this eventuality, which leads to all kinds of challenges, if you will, including the loss of local tax base. And this is especially problematic in small coastal communities, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So one of the things that we're doing is we've published a number of papers on this and reports and so forth, is looking at the international comparative study between the U.S. and New Zealand. And in fact, in the U.S., we've acquired over 65,000 homes and growing. It's often being discussed more and more as part of a national retreat strategy, if you will. But in reality, there's those that are pursuing these ideas often not drawing on the lessons that we've learned tied to the longstanding buyout program in the U.S., nor are we drawing international lessons. That's something that is particularly problematic. The good news is this was a study that was FEMA, the national office, asked me and a team to put this together, and also in collaborating with colleagues in New Zealand, and I'll talk about this in just a moment. The good news is, and it's particularly relevant to the linkage of environmental systems and social systems, is FEMA has a new multi-billion-dollar annual program called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. And that program can be used for a number of activities, including the acquisition of hazard-prone housing and the conversion of that space into water retention areas, or trying to convert it back to its natural state, for example. And at the same time, New Zealand is in the middle of their Climate Change Adaptation Act, and I'm working with them and advising them on the development of that program. So some of the findings in the U.S., this program is extremely difficult to administer. It's very complex. It requires a lot of capacity, whether it's technical, administrative. There's significant funding provided in the U.S., largely post-disaster. That's a problem. It's good, but it's also a problem because the funding can be very difficult to administer. It also comes into a community after disaster, and in many cases is overwhelming to administer these programs. There's often a limited emphasis on pre-event capacity building at the local and state level to administer these programs. And then there's also the idea that due to the limited pre-event planning for buyouts, there is a limited emphasis on a host of challenges, including how do you manage this open space? There's not funding available to manage the actual open space. And then also the idea that drawing lessons from states and local governments is not done very often. And I'll refer to that in more detail in just a moment. With the exception of wealthier communities, and this is an important case and one that's relevant to not only risk reduction and adaptation, but it's important. One, it's in the state of North Carolina, and it is one of the most, in many ways, one of the most impressive cases that I'm aware of in the country. So after Hurricane Floyd, Charlotte looked at this issue in a highly urbanized area, recognizing that they had multiple problems occurring simultaneously. One was poor water quality, limited access to parks and recreation, as well as economic development challenges that they faced. And so what they did is they developed a pre-event program that, in fact, it relies on local funding. They initially were using FEMA buyout dollars, and they've done that, but they've also created their own stormwater management program, and the stormwater management fees provide money that allow them to acquire flood-prone houses. And what they've done is they've created greenways that have improved water quality, that have improved recreational opportunities, and they've actually developed on the fringe or the exterior of the floodplains, thereby improving economic development. One of the other things that they've done that's really impressive is they have created what are called future conditions maps. So they have mapped their floodplains as if they're completely built out, which won't happen for decades. And that has led to dramatic increases in their flood elevation, both vertically and, of course, the horizontal extent. And in many cases, this has led to flood elevations of 8 to 12 feet in their communities. But they regulate their floodplains today as if they're already built out. And the reason I bring this up is it really is this notion of condition or mapping for the future. One of the problems with flood insurance rate maps is that they're static. They don't represent the dynamism of floodplains. And so that they have done this coupled with buyouts, coupled with the linkage of these ideas to greenways and water quality improvements and economic development. One of the ways, and also another impressive element of the Charlotte case, is that the reason this was done is that developers and others were pushing elected officials to say that we are building homes that comply with local flood ordinances, but they're flooding all the time. So the individuals working in the flood program worked with developers, and collectively they reached out to the town council, and they collectively encouraged the adoption of these higher standards, which is really impressive. So developers are actually pushing the policy because they want to have some understanding of risk so that they can build structures that don't flood repeatedly. So relative to the findings of the buyout study in New Zealand, it's actually quite an interesting juxtaposition, if you will. They modify their national policies following major disasters, whereas we have a very prescriptive long-term strategy to deal with buyouts. It's very difficult to administer. They modify their federal rules to deal with the types of disasters that they face. For example, they have, after the Christchurch earthquake, they have acquired over 7,000 properties, largely contiguous, because instead of doing a strictly voluntary buyout, they red zone parcels and basically said, you are not, we will not allow you to rebuild in these areas because they are deemed too dangerous. Now that could be very contentious, of course, but it's a different strategy that they have developed. But they don't have an ongoing funding program like we do in the US. So that can lead to really long-term buyouts, including, for example, in Medita, which I'll talk about in a moment. That took 15 years to complete the actual buyout program. The other issue that they've done is they're developing regeneration plans, if you will, and they're funding these plans, which are, what do you do with this open space post buyout? So that's actually quite impressive. But they also have the challenges, like you see in the upper image in the Whakatane district, which is, this is a homeowner that's put the sign up basically saying, don't take my property, look out, you're next. So I'm going to talk briefly about the Medita, New Zealand example. This is a landslide case, so it's a bit different than the earthquake case in Christchurch. This is, on the left is the steep sloped area. This is the mud flow that has come into the community and overwhelmed it with debris, slurry, boulders, and so forth. And so this is a map that shows the impacted area, the debris flow. They initially tried to use an engineering approach to reduce the likelihood of future rock falls and mudslides. It didn't work, and then they moved towards the idea of a buyout program. And so that is working. However, a lot of people are choosing to stay, so it's a real mixed bag, which is related to another issue that's going on in New Zealand and elsewhere, is how do you convey risk? These images, the image on the left is an image that I took in the Auckland Museum that basically is dealing with the White Island volcano, talking about the idea that it's privately owned. And if many of you may remember the volcanic eruption, well, it just so happens we were doing the case study research in Medita. The image on the right is a live image that I took when the volcano erupted. I was actually there in Medita near the White Island volcano, which tragically killed more than 20 people. But my point is that the idea of, like in New Zealand or in the US, often we discount risk. Similarly, another project that I have been working on is the buyout of hazard-prone properties in Hawaii. And worked with Hawaii County government on the Big Island a couple summers ago for a couple of months, thinking through the acquisition of properties in volcanic or lava flow zones, which is another issue, is that one is to map a floodplain and to understand its return period event. But in terms of volcanic eruption and engaging in a buyout program in Hawaii is also another challenge. Is one is the likelihood of the return period of the event, but also the deep place attachment that a lot of people have for these areas. In fact, many people are choosing to rebuild back on the former lava flow. So again, just a couple of quick examples of the real challenges that we face relative to housing acquisition programs. So one of the issues that all of this work has led to, and I know this is very small text, I'm just going to quickly describe it, is one of the more recent work, some of the more recent work that we're doing. In fact, these are preliminary findings of a poster that my student team has developed, is to think about how or what are some of the innovative buyout strategies that have been undertaken in U.S. communities. And we're looking at the policy literature, including two elements. One is what are called internal determinants, and the other is policy diffusion. Policy diffusion is the idea that lessons that are drawn from communities can be shared with others. And internal determinants, in essence, are what are those variables that exist at the local level that lead to policy innovation. You know, I've talked about the challenges of buyouts, but what we're doing is trying to identify through interviews with key informants, what are those variables? So what we found preliminarily is that there's very limited diffusion of information. For example, in the Charlotte case, while they're doing great work, a lot of other communities aren't gleaning that information and improving the buyout process. Charlotte's kind of a one-off. Tulsa, Oklahoma is another. But communities all over the U.S., especially rural communities, are really struggling, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The internal determinants components, what we found is that those political variables, including political support from local and state officials, is really important, as is the presence of leaders. They could be technical leaders. They could be leaders from trusted officials within the community outside of government. And we've also found that due to repetitive disasters, communities are striving and trying to take more innovative actions. This is work that's actually still underway. So I want to take a quick kind of stop check here, Dave, and see how we're doing on time. I wanted to talk about the Hurricane Matthew work and then just a few other topics. And then are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes for your
presentation. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so the Hurricane Matthew Disaster Recovery and Resilience Initiative, I want to talk a bit about community engagement. I mean, we've talked a bit about applied research, but I wanted to talk about engagement. This is an effort that was I stood up after Hurricane Matthew at the request of the governor's office and the director of North Carolina Emergency Management. And in essence, we were trying to assist communities with issues that weren't being addressed by governmental actors, FEMA or state or other nonprofits. We were asked to assist 6 hard-hit communities with modest capacity that are smaller communities, and we received significant funding from a number of entities, including the legislature, emergency management, the North Carolina Community Foundation, and so forth. If you're interested in this topical area at the bottom, all of the documents, all the materials that we've created can be found at the websites below. So these are just some images. I just want to give you some context. So for example, one of the things that was really useful is this educational and engagement initiative. We brought in a large student team, a large number of faculty, which I'll show you an actual org chart in just a moment. But on the upper right, these are students that are working in the disaster field office. The state gave us office facilities where we were co-located with them for 2 years. Some of these students, one is a PhD candidate at MIT. One of them is the deputy resilience officer for Miami. Another is a official that is an advisor to the FEMA National Office. So they've already moved into the work environment. And these are just some images of us in the field with communities doing surveys, but also getting ready for a public meeting, having a good dinner. This is the organizational chart that we developed. There were over 8 faculty and approximately 20 graduate students that worked with us, worked with these 6 communities for almost 2 years. We also work closely with North Carolina Emergency Management, as you can see on the right, as well as the governor's office. And some of the issues that we found, we interviewed all of the towns and we were looking at what are those issues that aren't being addressed. Many of them were dealing with issues of relocation and strategies associated with how can we relocate residents and try to keep them within the town because they're trying to avoid the loss of tax base. So we developed replacement housing alternatives and designs through the School of Architecture. We did land suitability analysis, looking at areas inside their jurisdictional limits, but outside the floodplain, adjacent to water and sewer, areas zoned for residential, distances to school, and so forth. This is just happens to be a map of Fair Bluff, North Carolina, and the green imagery, if you will, and the blue and purple are more appropriate for development. And you can see on the upper right-hand image that actually informed the development of a 36-unit affordable housing complex. We also looked at what do we do and how do we create better designs for the resulting open space. We looked at everything from educational forests to parks and thought about how they would connect and align with existing neighborhoods, and even looked at issues of commemoration. This is just one image of Seven Springs, thinking about how to relocate to higher ground. I won't dwell on it. This is another way to look at that same image. If you look at the same location, the downtown, the images on the right, those are all homes slated for demolition, beautiful old historic homes. And so we were coming up with a strategy for looking at how those homes could be physically relocated to higher ground, as shown in the red on higher ground. The last image, the last example of the Hurricane Matthew work I'll talk about is Princeville, North Carolina. This is actually an image that I took hanging out of a helicopter after Hurricane Floyd. And you can see Princeville on the right that was devastated. It was flooded again in Matthew. After Floyd, they chose not to pursue the buyout or acquisition of homes. After Matthew, they have. And one of the things that the state asked us to do is to look at a 52-acre site that they purchased that's noted in green at the bottom to give you some sense of scale. So I organized a team of 35 architects, land use planners, landscape architects, and others. We worked closely with North Carolina Emergency Management to provide necessary logistics and support. We had over 60 federal, state, and local officials, as well as local town officials and residents participating in this 5-day event. These are just some of the images of students and individual professionals that were working in the community. One of the things that I'm perhaps most proud of, and this was led by, the idea was created by Kofi Boone at NC State. We brought in some of the best designers in the country who happen to be African-American. And it really resonated with the town. And so these are just some of the folks working with students hand in hand on some of the big projects. If you're interested, we also had a crew that basically stayed with us for the 5-day event. That led to a PBS series, if you're interested in it, 3 towns, 3 rivers. The imagery that was shot during our workshop is part of that event. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to take a look at that, 3 towns, 3 rivers on PBS. The last thing I'll mention, I'm going to go through this very quickly because of the sense of time, is these are some of the imperatives, if you will, that we created going all the way back to the beginning of my remarks. The book that I referenced, we took 264 recommendations from all of the book chapters, and I distilled them into a set of imperatives. And I think this could serve as a way, a roadmap, if you will, to think about some of the big picture issues. I'm not going to dwell on them. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. One of them is a governance imperative, and thinking about how do we deal with different scales of development? How do we increase institutional diversity? How do we build governance capacity to grapple with some of these big challenges that I've talked about today? Also, the capability imperative. How do we confront barriers to adaptation? How do we develop a broader network of capacity builders, like the example I used in the Hurricane Matthew elements? How do we work with FEMA and other entities to try to develop better policies and programs? A planning imperative. How do we create a means or an ethic, if you will, that improves plans, pre-event planning? It's hard to do. As I alluded to in the buyout studies, most communities try to quote unquote plan in the throes of a disaster, whether it's in coastal Mississippi or elsewhere. How do we think through this? How can we do scenario-based planning practices that deal with and account for deep uncertainty? And then finally, this moral imperative. To me, I think this is as critical as any of them, is how do we, as a land-grant university, for example, recognize that we have a moral imperative to help people, including those in particular that are marginalized, that perhaps don't have a say. The image on the upper right, for example, is a photo that I took in Manila as part of a U.S. State Department program where I was advising the Philippine government on resilience and adaptation. This image, the reason it's powerful to me, you can't see, but on the backside is a large-scale levee. These are individuals that live on the inside of the levee on the stream channel, and these structures are scoured away almost every year in the rainy season. It's protecting downtown Manila. Thinking through issues like this, or the images on the bottom, which is Shishmaref, where the coastal town is falling into the ocean due to climate change. So how do we think through and what role can we play from a moral standpoint to address these issues? And then finally, in closing, what I would think about is, or at least suggest, is one of the ways we can deal with these issues is through education. And the graduate certificate in disaster resilient policy engineering design is something that I've created here at NC State. It was the genesis of that certificate was an Obama White House study that I led, that they'd asked us to look at the state of resilient design education in the US. And so those lessons, if you're interested, I'll show in a reference at the end, is that informed the set of core courses that you can see here. We also have, it's truly interdisciplinary. There are 3 tracks you can pursue, whether it's in design or engineering or public policy. These are just the references that are tied to the material, so I'm not going to go into those, but those are available if you would be interested in taking a look at those. So that is my presentation. I appreciate you sticking with it after our little hiccup. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks for giving you a round of applause, Gavin. I appreciate your seminar. Thanks again, Gavin. So we have time for questions. So you can raise your hand or you can put them in the chat.
This is Jay, Gavin. Have you seen positive changes within FEMA that have worked towards a little more rapid responsiveness during the recovery period to homeowners?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I work with FEMA a lot, and the short answer is I would suggest no, not nearly as much as it should be. Even though their national strategic plan talks about streamlining and simplifying their grant program. Well, I can tell you after Hurricane Matthew, for example, we worked with these communities for 2 years, and we had to stop. We had to basically cut it, just had to find a point to stop to go back to our own day-to-day activities. And that wasn't long enough because they were just starting to roll out the policies associated with the buyout programs. So we did all of this work, and it was really well-intentioned, but 2 years wasn't long enough. And so, and I've talked to, through these innovative buyout interviews, communities are still struggling. It can take 5 years or more to do, for example, these buyouts. And it doesn't have to be that hard. In fact, following Hurricane Floyd, we reached negotiated agreements with FEMA that sped up the buyouts, and they were much faster after Hurricane Floyd in 1999 than they are today. But the reason we were able to do that is because Governor Hunt was an advocate, and frankly, he was aligned with James Lee Witt, who wanted to be a Southern governor, and President Clinton. They all knew each other, and literally we would propose policy ideas, and it was pushed through in part because of political connectivity, which is a shame because it shouldn't, of course it shouldn't be that way. And so we use that influence to affect positive change to help people in North Carolina, but it shouldn't be that way.
I remember the governor mentioning that when he came to your class a year or so ago, 2 years ago.
Yeah, and it's a shame. It really is a shame. And ironically, working with Governor Barbour, a very conservative Democrat who was in power when President Bush was in power. So we were able to do, for example, get a $400 million grant to come up with improved emergency housing alternatives. The state of Louisiana wasn't able to do that. Which is a shame. It's just not right, but it's the reality, the politics of disaster, which is a whole nother conversation. Yeah.
Gavin, this is Russell Harmon. I'm an adjunct in MEES. I was on the Mississippi Gulf Coast for Camille, and my family were there for Katrina. Is there you spoke a bit about the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Is there now a state master plan for how to manage the coast in the context of global change, or is it just left to local jurisdictions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I don't know. There may be. What I can tell you is, and actually another project that I've worked on is the roles that governors play in disaster recovery. And actually there's a video that should be pretty easy to find where we interviewed, both Governor Hunt and Barber sat down for extended interviews. Actually, they both sat for 2 hours, which was really, we were really fortunate to have that. And Governor Barber talks about the need to develop new programs and strategies. I just don't know if they were. But certainly would be interested to talk with you. If you're from coastal Mississippi, it is a place that's near and dear to my heart. I grew up on Galveston Bay, and the people that I worked with there was just phenomenal, especially the people that suffered so much.
Well, I'm from Biloxi. I'd be happy to talk to you anytime.
I would love to do that. Yeah, in fact, had a place on the reservoir up in Jackson, but also a place down off of Calvin Lorraine in Biloxi. So anyway, yes, we should talk.
Okay.
Thanks, Russell. Gavin, we have a question from Dave Genero, who's a professor in the Department of Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences. He left a question in the chat. I can imagine buyouts of property are complicated, even with small neighborhoods of single-family homes. What's your view of the long-term in places like Miami, with possibly many billions of dollars of property at risk?
That's a great question. In fact, it literally was one of the topics we discussed in class that I teach last night on disaster resilient policy, engineering, and design. So, the big cities of America and around the world are going to figure out ways to protect these assets. In many cases, it's going to be through structures like levees and seawalls and so forth, which have their own challenges. They're multifold, but one is the creation of these armoring tools degrade or do not allow dynamic systems like barrier islands or the coastal zone migrate or move as they do naturally, which can end up losing, for example, it can lose the protected beach, among other things. But also what it has done is these protective measures can lead to a false sense of security and ironically lead to greater investments behind those protective measures. And then when those design standards are exceeded, can lead to catastrophic loss. So just a quick aside, after Hurricane Katrina, the U.S. government spent $14 billion repairing the levee system in New Orleans. And certainly I have and others have made the argument that it's already out of date. That $14 billion was used to rebuild the levee to the 1% annual chance flood event. In an era of climate change, again, the question I asked in my presentation, what is the right design standard? Should we do like the Dutch and design for the 500 or even the 1,000-year flood? And if so, who pays for it? It would be astronomically expensive. So these are big, big questions that I think are fundamental for us to grapple with. The other thing I mentioned relative to Miami, like other places, and some people may not know this, but actually migration is already happening. Communities are migrating off of the waterfront, and which is also troubling in some ways. It's leading to disaster gentrification. So there is a community called Little Haiti in Miami that is slightly inland. It's on higher ground, and people are moving off the ocean front and buying and building and basically pricing people out of the market, if you will, in this community. And those are the kinds of things that we're going to be seeing as this disaster displacement and disaster gentrification. It's already happening, and Miami is one of the places where it's most acute.
Gavin, I think we're seeing that in, I keep hearing about folks from a lot of these coastal hazard areas buying property in Asheville and really jacking up the real estate prices there as well. So I think it's happening regionally as well.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments in the chat?
Gavin, this is Amanda Mueller. I'm just curious if you could talk about the level of interest in the buyouts. As you mentioned, there's a lot of, in some of these underserved communities that are hardest hit, right? There is that strong community bond that's very difficult for them to leave. And so the level of interest within those communities, and then also what type of support there may be for those communities to have a full community migration.
Yeah, those are great questions. So it's all over the board. A lot of communities are reticent to participate. In North Carolina, it's the more and more neighborhoods and homeowners are willing to participate, in part because they've been hit multiple times, like in Kinston. After Hurricane Fran, we bought out about 120 homes, and then after Florida, we bought out an additional 600 plus homes. So being flooded repeatedly certainly can affect it. However, there is, again, this deep place attachment. So places like Princeville, many people don't want to leave. And so one of the options that they were given after Hurricane Matthew is to elevate in place. One of the real tragedies of that example, in fact, we were talking about this in class last night, is that a lot of residents didn't realize the flood elevation with which they would be elevated to. And so some of the homes are literally elevated, and then the elderly single person that owned that house realizes they can't live in it. It's elevated 15, 20 feet in the air. And it's tragic to see they don't even contemplate that because they haven't been shown physically a visual representation of what that policy will, how it will manifest itself. And in fact, that's a very focused example, but that's an example that I use in our certificate program, is the ability of people, policymakers, to work with designers to be able to visualize these different policy options. My career has dealt with talking about it and writing about it. I'm not a designer, even though I'm in the College of Design, but those that can physically show what these policies look like, that's another way of communicating that I would argue, we really need to adopt. And so that's an important part of our certificate program.
And Gavin, just a quick question to follow on to Amanda's question. Are you familiar with any application of augmented reality types of approaches to help visualize those sorts of future changes?
Yes, I am aware of it to some extent. I think that would be a fascinating type of project to work with. In fact, I've talked to some of the people in the College of Design thinking about how do we show this augmented reality, as you say. You know, I've seen some pretty rudimentary stuff from NOAA, which is great. It's better than what's out there from an agency standpoint. They show flood elevations and flood rise, sea level rise with different scenarios, but it's somewhat basic. One, it's a static map, and there are some examples of showing hypotheticals where you're looking into a community, but there's much more, I think, to be done in that space. That would actually be a really interesting project. I mean, it could be an community engagement project, but it could also be a research project to actually try to understand what representations would be most effective at conveying change, or at least acceptance of risk, and then even willingness to take action. It kind of goes back to the examples I was describing in Metata, New Zealand, and Hawaii. Kind of a discounting of risk. It's very common.
Any other questions? Okay, looks like Amanda in the chat, USGS has a really cool 3D virtual depiction of flooding for parts of North Carolina. Gavin, we're about out of time, and we're going to take about a 5-minute break and then reconvene with just the semester at CMAS students for our sort of virtual brown bag discussion. Before I close, I do want to put you on the spot a little bit and just ask you, you had a lot of recommendations towards the end and just a tremendous amount of experience. And so if you were to give the sort of elevator pitch to the governor, one of the overarching questions we're hoping to address with this seminar series is with respect to coastal resilience and sustainability, what's the future of research and communications? So if you were to have to boil that down to an elevator pitch, what would that be?
Yeah, in fact, it's a similar question that was posed. There was a panel, or a conference that was held by members of the state legislature, in Greenville. I guess it was about a month or two ago. Time flies. But a similar question was asked. And to me, if you had to distill down, what is the fundamental challenge that we face in the U.S. is we need to invest more time and effort on building the capacity of states and local governments to grapple with these challenges. We tend to spend billions in the aftermath, but we spend virtually nothing on the front end building the capacity needed to administer these programs, to do better planning, and better design. That to me in a nutshell is the most critical issue, and it has been for decades. I think Dave, you're on mute if you're.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. Again, if we can just give Gavin a round of applause, and we're going to take a 5-minute break and reconvene
Thanks,
with
Gavin.
just the students. All right.
Okay, we'll see you. Thanks, Dave. Take care, everybody.